So how do we decide what techniques are good for self-defense? Hi guys, my name is Joe and welcome to Fighting Words, the martial arts library. On this channel I review martial arts books and talk about other martial arts related subjects. This idea sort of came out of me reading The Defensive Tactics of the Gangster Era by Robert Sabat. In that book, it has kind of a unique format where they will take articles written in the 1920s on self-defense, and then it will have commentary from members of the Rough and Tumble Society, which is a modern group talking about more or less Western-style self-defense. The backgrounds of the participants, usually they have kind of a solid background in Fairbairn-style combatives, from W.E. Fairbairn in World War II. We're also seeing background in things like boxing and Krav Maga mixed in there as well. But throughout, what we're getting is the commentary where these guys will talk about why something is or isn't a good technique for self-defense, why they would or wouldn't recommend it. And that got me thinking that that's not a subject I've really covered here. Now, I've touched on it when I have reviewed self-defense books. For instance, one of my first reviews was on Bruce Lee's Fighting Method, Volume 1, which was on self-defense, and I wasn't particularly thrilled with the selection of techniques. And I got some pretty negative feedback on that, but people are going to worship Bruce Lee, I guess. But for instance, he would have something like the hook kick. Not the Jeet Kune Do hook kick, but what's more commonly known as the hook kick, which is a kick at head height where you throw your leg in one direction and sweep it back in a different direction. And this is something that requires a high degree of athleticism and also doesn't have a very good chance of ending the fight by itself, which is why I would say that it wasn't a good self-defense technique. So, among other things, one of the first things we look at to see if something is a good self-defense technique is to see if it is accessible. Now, every technique is going to work better if you happen to be bigger, stronger, faster, and more athletic. However, the success of a technique should not be based on that. In other words, if the only way a technique works is because you're stronger than the other guy, it's a bad technique for self-defense because we are not going to assume that we're going to be attacked by smaller, weaker people. We're going to assume that if someone decides that we are a good target to be attacked, that they are probably bigger and stronger than we are. Now, this isn't an excuse to ignore physical fitness for self-defense. Technique is important. This is a skill-based area of study, but also do some push-ups now and then. It helps to be physically fit, it helps to be strong, it helps to be fast. But again, the success of a technique shouldn't be based on, the fact that I'm somebody built like Eddie Hall and am able to crush watermelons just by squeezing them. So that's one of the first things we look at for a self-defense technique. Is this thing reliant, for instance, on me being able to kick at the height of my head? That's a degree of flexibility and balance that not everybody will have. Is this thing only going to work if I have the element of surprise on my hands? Again, everything works better with the element of surprise, but if it's dependent on the other guy not knowing he's in a fight until I make my first move, if that's the only way it'll work, it's a bad technique. Another thing to look for, as I alluded to, is whether or not the technique can potentially end the threat of violence. And by that, for me, that usually means eliminating techniques that only work if they cause pain. Pain is something that might not be felt in the heat of a fight, either because of drugs or adrenaline, or tough people are simply able to sort of grit their teeth and, power through something that might cause pain to other people. So when we are looking at a technique, it needs to be able to disrupt the structure of the opponent, their skeletal structure basically, looking for things like locks against the joints. It needs to be able to shut down the brain, either through concussive impact, in other words, a strike, or something else that might cut off the blood supply or cause the blood pressure to drop like a choke. In weapons-based self-defense, this might include techniques that are aimed at the vascular areas of the opponent in order to cause them to bleed out. So again, that's our other criteria, is whether or not this technique is capable of actually ending a fight, or whether it's reliant on pain. Pain is a bonus. If it causes the guy to go ouchie, That's good. But more than anything else, we're trying to shut down the brain primarily. Or if we need to release ourselves from a hold or a lock, we need to be able to break the structure of the lock that they're applying. Another good indicator of a good self-defense technique is that it has few moving parts. I remember one time in a Kung Fu class being shown a release from a wrist grab that was 3 steps long. And to me, that's 2 steps too many. My dad, who wrestled in high school, showed me if somebody grabs your wrist, you just roll your wrist in the direction of their thumb, which is the weakest point of the grip, and it'll break the grip. And that's something that'll even hold true against bigger, stronger people in most cases. So we're looking at 1 step to get out of a wrist grab versus 3 steps to get out of a wrist grab. At each preceding step, something else could go wrong. So the fewer steps something has, the better it is for self-defense. Another aspect to look at is whether or not the technique could potentially cause harm to ourselves. This is one of the reasons that some people will eschew headbutts for self-defense. It's one of the reasons why people tend to recommend palm strikes over punches, because if you punch someone, there's a chance that you could break your knuckles, particularly the 5th metacarpal. And if you injure yourself while you're in the self-defense situation, that would further hinder your ability to defend yourself. Again, going back to headbutts, you don't want to risk knocking yourself out while you're defending against somebody who's trying to knock you out. So if we go back and look at those criteria, what we are looking at are things that don't require one to be physically superior to the opponent. We're looking at things that can potentially end a fight that are not based on causing pain. We're looking at techniques that take fewer steps to execute. And we're looking at things that will not cause harm to oneself while we are executing them. So that's basically the criteria where I look for self-defense techniques, and I'm curious to know what yours are. There's a lot of people have a lot of different ideas on self-defense. I'll go ahead and say that for self-defense, I'm okay with using punches because I've toughened my punches. I've practiced against unpadded targets, so I have an idea about how to hit without injuring my hand. Similarly with headbutts, I would use them sparingly, but I would include them because I think that there are some scenarios where they're simply the best weapon. And of course, I do try to maintain a certain level of fitness so that, I can give my techniques extra horsepower even if they don't require it to make it work. So anyway, handing it over back to you guys. What techniques do you think will work best in a fight? Are there any criteria here that I missed or any that you would change? If so, let me know in the comment section, and I'll catch you guys later. Thank you.